So, we continue Zoroastrianism, the Religion of the Good Life, by Rustom Masani, with Chapter 1. The background of the Creed. The holy faith, which is of all things best. Well, as far as it has been translated correctly and preserved correctly, right? These are the simple words in which the Zoroastrian creed is spoken of in the Ustavati Gatha. The Vendidad is more effusive in its exaltation of the faith, as much as a great stream flows swifter than a slender rivulet, so much above all utterances in greatness, goodness, and fairness is this law, this Dava, demon, destroying law of Zarathustra. As high as the great tree stands above the small plants it overshadows, so high above all other utterances in greatness, goodness, and fairness is this law, this Dava destroying law of Zarathustra. Well, the jinn have respite, but certainly the evil effects, I guess. As high as heaven is above the earth, that it compasses around, so high above all other utterances is this law, this Dava destroying law of Mazda. Since the days of the Gathas and the Vendidad, many a new religion has embraced by different members of the human family, and none would venture today to indulge while speaking of the creed of Zarathustra in the superlatives used in the Zoroastrian scripture. Nevertheless, a follower of the prophet may feel justly proud that the faith he professes once illuminated the entire trans-Himalayan world, swayed the thoughts and influenced the philosophy of cultured Greeks and Romans, influenced also Judaism, and through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam saw and confirmed that this faith at its roots was what is referred to by the term Islam. The priestcraft and some stuff attributed to it, no. And left its impress on the spiritual and intellectual development of the human race. In the 6th century BCE, Europe came to know of the religion and philosophy of Iran through Hostinez, the Archimagus who accompanied Xerxes in his expedition against Greece in the 4th century BCE. Plato, Aristotle, and Theopompus show a knowledge of the work of the Magian prophet. In the 3rd century BCE, Hermippus, speaks expressly of these works as containing not less than 120,000 verses, and during the beginning of the Christian era, Nicolaus of Damascus, Strabo, Pausanias, Pliny, and Dio Chrysostom mention under different names works attributed to Zarathustra. In the 3rd century, St. Clement of Alexandria shows familiarity with the Zoroastrian scriptures, and later the Gnostics make use of the Oriental cosmology and psychology as derived from Zarathustra. In the 4th century, according to the testimony of Eusebius, there existed a collection of sacred works of the Iranians. Empress Eudokia, in the 5th century of the Common Era, refers to several books of the prophet, 4 of which treat of nature, 1 of precious stones, and 5 of astrology and pronostics. Relationship between Zoroastrianism and Judaism. At one time, Christian divines, well, as they thought themselves, I guess, thought that the creed of the Sage of Iran was borrowed from the Jewish faith. In his classic work on the connection of the Old and New Testaments, De An Pradaux, misled by God, Pradaux, do you pronounce the X at the end? Misled by misguided authorities, went so far as to suggest that it was a copy of Judaism, and that the prophet's familiarity with all the sacred writings of the Old Testament that were then extant made it most likely that he was, as to his origin, a Jew. The theory has since been repudiated by many a savant, but as such misconceptions die hard, it is necessary to state at length, even at the risk of being prolix, a few historical facts and the inferences drawn therefrom by Christian scholars. About 600 years before the Christian era, the Jews, who were carried away as captives into Babylon, were in constant contact with the Iranians. During the 70 years of their exile, they borrowed from the Zoroastrian faith various doctrines such as the belief in the immortality of the soul, the resurrection of the body, and future reward and punishment. That point isn't as clear as one might think. It is well known, that point can be overturned, actually. It is well known, said Max Mueller, that these doctrines were entirely or almost entirely absent from the old phase of religion among the Jews. Dr. West elaborates this argument. It can be said that about 540 or the 540s, Judaism was invented. It didn't get the title Judaism for another few hundred, over 300 more years, but the second book of Maccabees is when the title for the title first appeared, but Judaism proper could go back a couple more decades or so. But something you could call Judaism about 540. Okay, I guess maybe for the most part I'll leave out some of the footnotes, but few Christians will be disposed to admit, he says, that they owe their ideas of the resurrection and the future world to the traditions of the Mazdian religion, and yet they will find it difficult to disprove it. Let those who doubt this fact ascertain how many decided references to the resurrection and future life they can find in the earlier scriptures of the Jews written before they came into contact with the Syrians and the Parthians, and then compare them with the more frequent references to the same subjects in the later Psalms and Prophets, the book of Job, and the New Testament, all written after the Jews had become acquainted with the Persian traditions. In fact, the book of Job has some appearance of being a translation or adaptation from a Persian or Assyrian text. Please remember that there is, until about 2,000 years ago, the rows, columns, and numbers of letters had some fluidity, not as much as the Christian text, which could change whole chapters over the generations, but the Christian side of the Bible. But there were certainly changes being made, and any archaeologist who knows their biblical textual history, they can show that there's been a lot of changes over the years. More variations in a single book of Genesis than there is in the dialectical versions of Quran, and of course you're going to find contradictions and stuff like this. Of course, Genesis was probably the most changed. An Illuminist article contributed to the 19th century on Zoroaster and the Bible. Dr. L.H. Mills draws attention to what he calls the now doubtful and long since suspected fact that it pleases the divine power to reveal some of the most important articles of our Catholic creed first to the Zoroastrians and through their literature to the Jews and ourselves. To sum up, I would say, as speaking from an Orthodox point of view, that while the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments are unrivaled in their majesty and fervor, really, the New Testament, before you turn into English and stuff, is the book of Revelations is, like the worst written thing in the Bible, really. Linguistically. Consulting perhaps, the most impressive objects of their kind known to the human mind, and fully entitled to be described as inspired, yet the humbler, but to a certain extent prior religion of the Mazda worshippers was useful in giving point and body to many loose conceptions among the Jewish religious teachers, and introducing many ideas which were entirely new, while as to the doctrines of immortality and resurrection, the most important of all, positively determined belief. But the greatest and by far noblest service which it rendered was the propagation of the doctrine that virtue is chiefly its own reward, even in the great religious reckoning, and vice its own punishment. And some 1800s books being sources here. Dr. T.K. Chine, Cheyne, goes into greater detail and observes in his lectures on the origin and religion and religious context of the Psalter in the light of the Old Testament criticism and the history of religions. For centuries before the period of the Psalter, Iranian religion has its own independent development, and its doctrine of the last things, as you will probably agree, is peculiarly its own. A knowledge of this first religion is necessary to the full equipment of an Old Testament scholar. It is no longer excusable to study the Old Testament religion without comparing Zoroastrianism. Later, he says, admit a Zoroastrian influence upon the Essenism, and all becomes clear. The Fravashis voluntarily assumed mortal bodies in order to fight for God and for goodness against the power of the evil one. Similar to this, we may reasonably hold, was the belief of the Essenes respecting the descent of souls, a belief dependent for its full development upon Zoroastrianism, but not without Jewish germs. And what about the final act, which I have ventured to postulate for the Essenian drama of the soul? Is that not also a piece of Hebraized Zoroastrianism? The doctrine of an eternal life, open to all the righteous and involving a transfiguration of the body, is neither a mere evolution out of an old Semitic belief in Sheol, nor yet a direct importation from any foreign system of thought. Had it not come into contact with Zoroastrianism, Israel would, historically speaking, have struggled in vain to satisfy its greatest religious aspirations, and yet it is not to Persia alone that the church nation was indebted for its greatest religious acquisition. The distinction between spirit and body must have begun to grow up long before this, the 73rd Psalm, that the Jewish religion might be prepared for the molding influence of a more advanced system of thought. And what was this more highly developed system? Zoroastrianism. If the preceding arguments are well founded, it's very essential for us to look at the simple fact that if God sent prophets, wouldn't God be sending prophets again to give us a more concise version of guidance that works in the area we have, and trying to restore things that obviously would have degraded, instead of leaving us in confusion of, well, the Spirit must be in you and guide you to the truth. Wait, there's a bunch of lies in here? And then the missionary tells you, no, that's not what I mean. That's kind of what it sounds like, dude. The Jewish angelology and demonology are also based on Zoroastrian ideas concerning the Amesha Spentas, or the divine attributes personified as divine intelligences, and the concept of the evil spirit, which passed from the Jewish to the Christian religion, was also influenced by the belief in the existence of Angra Mainyu. Asmodeus, who figures in the apocryphal book of Tobit, is positively the Mazdian wrath demon, Ashma Dava. This shows, says Everett, that a way was open by which the Parsi devils could enter into Judea, and if one member of the evil host found his way thither. There is no reason to think that he came alone. Satan makes his first appearance in Jewish literature in the book of Job. There's only 13 mentions in Tanakh of Hashatan, which may not be a misrendering of Ha-Sathan, the adversary. See the first video on my Satan and Satanism list to define the linguistics of Satan in the so-called Old Testament. It is now claimed by the best authorities such as Davidson, Driver, and Cheyenne, Cheyne, I don't know, that this book was written during the time of the captivity. It would thus not be impossible that the writer should have been influenced by Mazdian thought. The latest refutation of the theory of indebtedness of Zoroastrianism to the Jewish faith comes from the pen of one of the modern students of religion, Dr. Charles Gore. While dismissing the suggestion of an alien source, he observes clearly it is not possible to suggest that this lofty religion, however closely resembling the Jewish faith, could have been borrowed from the Jewish. Its date renders that impossible, nor is there any other alien source to which it can be attributed. It remains in its lofty severity a momentous creation, if it be not wiser to call it, as Zoroaster himself would have called it, a signal inspiration by the divine spirit of an individual prophet. I don't like the word divine. It implies that everything's a god. And, everything owned by God, the demon's divine spirit, same thing. It's possible to take this back, not to some Aries age, but definitely to some age of Taurus, even towards the beginning of the age of Taurus. So when the tribes, those 5 tribes, the Hindus and the Persians, were, when there was a flux of some sort, around maybe 8,000 BCE. When one thinks of a religion, around 6,000 BCE, 5,000 BCE, maybe 8,000 BCE, who knows? That would take it further back, wouldn't it? Indo-Iranian concepts. When one thinks of a religion, the questions which comes uppermost one's mind are: who was its founder? Where and when did he reveal his faith? What was the state of society in those days? What was the background on which his creed rested? And attempting to answer those questions with reference to the religion of the Prophet of Iran, we find ourselves lost in the midst of time. And what is here mentioned as a demon is mere I'm not going to share that. Okay. In the dim old days of the Aryan ancestors of the present-day Parsis and Hindus lived together for long ages in a region which we have no means of locating definitely. When they, there's this one spot in Afghanistan, I think, where the mythology kind of points us. When they thus kept together as one race and spoke the same language, the religion of the land was the religion of the race. The fiend of discord, however, caused a rift in the loot. Owing to a change of thought among the members of that happy family, there was a cleavage. One of the sections migrated to Iran and the other to India, which became those 4 tribes. According to the Avesta, the Aryas, the noble ones, had their origin in the home of the fair land of Aryana Vaja, the cradle land of the Aryans. Balgangadar Tilak locates it in the Arctic regions, whence the Aryans descended into the Pamirs. It was far north it was far to the north, where the year seemed as a day. Both these branches of the Aryan stock divided the universe into 7 regions. Of the common worship and common legends of the 2 sister communities, a few relics have been preserved in the Avestan text. The parallels in the Avestan thought and the Vedic concepts are, indeed, many, but the contrasts which lead to the schism are also numerous. And I'm going to leave off here, and we are going to go into chapter 2, the prophet, another time. So, Krishna Pura Hora Hemasta Ashambhaha Kamnamasta Ashambhaha.